Hi everyone, my name is Meg Alderman. I'm a senior consultant with Deloitte Switzerland. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about blockchain. Now, this might not be a new topic for all of you, but hopefully you can take something away from this video. So blockchain is an immutable digital ledger that can be used not just for financial transactions, but virtually everything that we do. Some examples would be storage of our digital identities to farm-to-fork traceability for the groceries we purchase on a weekly basis. Some key characteristics of blockchain is it's near real time, it is peer-to-peer, meaning you don't need a trusted third party or middleman, it is distributed, so proof of the transaction is in more than one place, and it is immutable. So once the file is created, it cannot be edited. This then increases trust and reduces risk and fraud for transactions that use blockchain. So now that you know that blockchain technology is decentralized, distributed, immutable, real-time, and secure, I'm going to give a simple example of blockchain technology in 100 words using some blockchain lingo. So you're a node. You have a file of transactions on your computer. Let's call that your ledger. You're working with some accountants. Let's call them your miners who have the same file on their computers, so now it's distributed. You send a reply all email to these accountants to see if you have enough money to make a big purchase. They rush to review your file as they want to get paid in their salaries. Let's call that Bitcoin. The first accountant to review your request, validate along with their reasoning, which would be the proof of work, then sends this to the other accountants. If the other accountants agree with his reasoning, then you've got consensus in the network, and a new block can be added on the blockchain, and you can make that big purchase. That's blockchain technology.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Data Resilience SpectrumCast. I'm your host, Steve Keniston, and as always, Randy Arsenault, Trisha Jang, and Sean Sperry here with me today. And we have a pretty interesting conversation, I think, today. So with all the digital transformation that's happening and folks looking at new and interesting technologies such as blockchain and thinking about how blockchain can help their business, it raises some interesting questions. And I've actually heard this among different groups that I've listened to talk about either, do you need to protect the blockchain? So if I'm architecting that solution, do I need to protect it? Or is there a way to maybe take advantage of blockchain for data protection? Now, Randy, you brought up this, hey, maybe we should have a SpectrumCast on it, and I do think we should. So why don't you give us a little bit of your perspective?
Sure. So the reason why I thought this might be kind of an interesting topic of discussion is there's a couple of kind of dimensions to it that I think are relevant to discussions that we often have about data resilience. One of them is that you're seeing situations where blockchain technology and blockchain services are being used as ways to actually augment or improve data protection and resilience practices. So the technology itself is being used as kind of a value add in some ways within the data protection and resilience space. And the other piece of it is as blockchain technology continues to grow and evolve and expand and gets incorporated into more and more workflows and more commerce models and sort of consumer models, it is itself requiring resilience and protection. So I think it's interesting in the sense that it's both, and I would almost make the analogy, and Trisha and Sean both talk about one of the important elements of resilience is actually backing up your backups, so that in the event you're attacked or you have some disruptive event, you want to make sure that your backups have been in some way isolated or protected such that they're not subjected to that same attack. I think blockchain is starting to have that same characteristic where it's both an enabling technology or an augmentation technology for protection and resilience, but it is itself also vulnerable to attacks and has to be protected. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting, and I think, blockchain as an enabling technology is really interesting. I mean, it's had its ups and downs, obviously, since it kind of came to the fore with Bitcoin, but there's a lot of really, really interesting applications. I mean, just kind of researching for this call, I found a lot of really fascinating uses of blockchain, not just in the the spaces you hear the most about, whether it's, digital currency or, trusted supply chain relationships and things of that nature, it's being deployed in humanitarian relief initiatives and voter registration initiatives. So it's a really interesting, in many ways, transformational technology. So I just thought it would be kind of fun to talk about. And I will freely admit I am by no means anywhere remotely approaching an expert in blockchain. I mean, I understand it about this much, which is enough to be dangerous, but I just think it's really interesting. So I think if we can stimulate a discussion within the community around the implications of resilience and data protection for blockchain, that might be kind of a cool thing to do.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think all of us are kind of neophytes in this whole blockchain thing. And like you said, doing some research for this, there's a great video we all watched. And, they talk about some things like that, the fact that blockchain is near real time. So we have technologies like CDP on the data protection side that are sometimes too costly to implement, but maybe near real time with blockchain is interesting. It's peer-to-peer. So you always have a protection server talking to a client. It's distributed, and a lot of our backup environments are pretty huge, and it's immutable, which everybody's looking for in this whole cyber threat set of environments. So, it kind of brings up, why couldn't you use blockchain for protection?
Now, I suppose you could also potentially argue, maybe just conceptually or philosophically, that something like blockchain in some ways is meant to obviate the need for traditional data protection and resilience, right? Because the whole idea is, by having this distributed peer-to-peer model, you're less reliant on traditional methods of backup and recovery or point-in-time recovery. Because the whole idea of this distributed peer-to-peer network concept is that every transaction, every element of the blockchain has its own embedded, chain of custody that goes along with it. And that is, to your point, immutable. It's built on consensus. It's digitally signed. It's encrypted. So the idea is that, in theory, that should reduce the need for some of the traditional means of data protection and resilience. But again, it also introduces new ways that it could be at risk. So,
well,
go ahead, John. Sorry.
I was going to say, I think, data resiliency is one way to look at it here. Yes, in a distributed methodology like this, you may have many thousands of copies of the data, but your copy of the data, right, might need to benefit from some sort of data protection, just so that in the event of loss, your particular node could come back up really quickly, right? Which is different than a total disaster recovery loss. Is just a loss of your particular service in the blockchain.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, there have been some very visible and very public examples of this. I mean, there was a big blockchain DDoS hack or attack that occurred in 2017, I think it was. And it just obliterated 50% of the value of Bitcoin in the span of, a 24-hour period. So it's absolutely not invulnerable to attacks. It requires a new kind of attack and different levels of sophistication, but it's not immune. So how are organizations and entities enhancing blockchain platforms to be more resilient to those kinds of attacks?
Yeah, and one of the typical attacks I hear about blockchain is the Sybil attack. And this goes back to your point, Randy, about it's a consensus model where decisions are made on a consensus. So if you get enough of these nodes spoofing and trying to throw the vote, so to say, then you can end up with inaccurate data or some type of attack.
Yep.
And I think that's where we start talking about data protection being needed for those nodes and all, in case there is some type of spoof and you got to do some type of rollback.
Yeah, and I think that's more, as I said off the top, I think, as with a lot of emerging technologies, blockchain is becoming more, enterprise-ized, for lack of a better word, in that it is still largely a distributed peer-to-peer, network that doesn't have, the concept of, master nodes and nodes that are, subservient to that node or something like that. But as these blockchain services become more deeply embedded into enterprise workloads and enterprise application spaces, they start to increasingly reside on-prem and or in some kind of a hybrid multi-cloud architecture. So, at that point, they need to be treated like any other service in terms of how they're protected and how their resiliency is assured. So it's interesting. From my perspective, what I find sort of curious about it or interesting about it is that what's the tipping point? Like, at what point does blockchain become so widespread and so pervasive that it just becomes another standard, service offering by Amazon, by Microsoft, and in fact it already is, and it is by IBM as well. But what's the point at which you lose the philosophical benefits, I guess, of blockchain, this distributed, trust-based, consensus-driven platform, and it starts to become just another, vertically oriented enterprise service? I don't know if that will ever happen, but I just think that's kind of.
I think it does lend itself to asking a lot of questions, and this is where I hear it come up a lot, and why I actually thought it was a good time to have a conversation, Randy. So you have to think about, to your point, when does it become so pervasive that everyone's using it, and then when it does, what's the next step, right? Do I need to make sure I'm protecting it, or are there new sets of capabilities being built into applications to do the protection of blockchain? And how do those affect my architecture? Do I need to change things? Do I need to be prepared for that? Yep. Or, going even further, are vendors like IBM, right, building maybe a new platform of protection around what is a blockchain, right? And how does that change an architecture? And if I implement that as a client taking advantage of this new set of technologies, is there something there I should think about, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, in practical terms, blockchain is like a lot of the other kind of transformational, technologies that appear every so often, that it fundamentally shifts the way organizations think about delivering IT services. I mean, DevOps kind of did the same thing. It really disrupted the way services are conceived and developed and deployed and managed and sustained. This is the same thing on an even larger scale, arguably, right? So there's tons of examples of financial institutions that are getting either disintermediated entirely. I mean, one of the big advantages of blockchain is it can obviate the need for that intermediary, whether it's a governing body or a brokerage kind of a service or a contract carrier or something like that. It eliminates the need for that. So it's forcing organizations to think about new ways that they can value add on top of what blockchain already delivers. And that's a pretty, and of course, not surprisingly, you're seeing like a million consultancies and best practices and methodologies that are cropping up. And, IBM, again, as I think I mentioned earlier, has been a pretty active player in this space. But, all the big consultancies and all the big service providers and integrators are fully on board the blockchain train.
Yeah, and like you're showing a paper on IBM and blockchain and GDPR, but my quick search also showed, for instance, a paper out there on using the Spectrum Scale, Spectrum Protect, Spectrum Virtualize, and all the Spectrum products in conjunction with blockchain. So you're right, there's a lot of these types of solutions being put out there by the different entities.
Yeah. Another really interesting one that I think was announced at Think in 2018 was this initiative called Trade Lens, which is a consortium of technology providers and freight forwarders and supply chain players. It was originally developed by IBM in conjunction with Maersk, and I think they now have about 120 different supply chain partners. And the whole idea is to develop a fully blockchain-enabled digital supply chain. So things like electronic bills of lading, and again, a lot of the contractual obligations that exist within a supply chain workflow can be deployed on blockchain. So it makes it faster, it's more efficient, it's more reliable. It can, be more easily consumed by larger numbers of people within the supply chain. So it's a really, really interesting enabling technology. But again, we keep kind of saying this, but like any other technology that explodes on the scene like this and gains this kind of momentum, it becomes attractive as an attack vector for bad actors and cyber threats and things of the like. So what should we be thinking about as a data protection and resilience kind of community to mitigate that risk.
And there's those different levels of protection already being discussed on that. Are we just protecting the node and the wallet, or are you trying to protect the entire application, which a lot of times requires you to do a shutdown and then back up that entire directory so you have a consistent backup? So there are a lot of considerations if you are running blockchain. And of course, we've all heard, the terrible story about the person who lost their password to all their Bitcoins out there and now has millions of dollars sitting on it. So once again, it's a lot of the same issues, but then a lot of new issues coming up as well.
So I have an interesting question thinking about this conversation. This might be a little esoteric, but bear with me. So we know that data is growing unabounds. There's just no borders anymore, right? And we know that your backup environment is usually 4 times larger than your primary storage environment, right? On average, right? And then now if you start thinking about blockchain and all the bits and bytes living in multiple places on multiple systems, right? Even with capabilities such as deduplication, how does that change if you were to, and I don't think we're going to ever have a backup solution based on blockchain in the next 10 years, but how would this change if you were to kind of leverage that type of methodology for data protection and have this very distributed model? Does that help data growth? Does that hurt data growth? I'm trying to think of, are there ways that this could actually maybe help you from a data management perspective and thinking about where all this is, or does it become more complicated because it's all over the place? I don't know.
I think it's already happening, right? I mean, I think you're already seeing cases where some of these workloads that are, migrating to a blockchain or a distributed ledger model are, I think the amount of data is going to increase, I'm assuming, because it's like the blockchain itself is immense, right? And each of the blocks or objects or contracts within that ledger are large, but they're large, but they're highly distributed, right? So it's like, yes, I think it's going to create a lot more data, but is it necessarily explicitly going to create more data for individual enterprises to back up and protect? I don't know the answer. I suspect it's in some cases yes, in some cases no, but it's a good question.
Do we think it ever obfuscates the need for doing backups? I mean, does it ever become that secure?
I can't imagine it would. I mean, I just can't imagine any enterprise, and especially, based on compliance requirements and industry specific requirements, I can't imagine any industry would ever completely abrogate responsibility for their data sovereignty and backup to a distributed, peer-to-peer network. I mean, again, maybe I'll be proven wrong, but.
I think you're right, Randy, because it comes down to the fact that like a virus, if something were to be spread amongst all of these different blockchain pieces, then that's widespread. How do you roll it back? You've got to have that backup to be able to roll it back to.
Yeah. And I mean, the blockchain does allow for, implicitly allows for kind of point in time recovery or rollback or reconstitution of a transaction or a contract at some previous point in time. But as I understand it, it's very compute intensive and resource intensive to do that. So if you had to do it, which again, going back to the DDoS attack on Bitcoin, having to do it at scale is a big problem. It takes a lot of time. It's very disruptive. So, it's like the scale of the threat corresponds to the scale of the risk and the recovery requirements, I guess.
Sean, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I've never seen such an application, right? I've seen many mathematical algorithms that have been applied to computing that gave you certain results, and you could say prove mathematically that these things will never fail. But when you mix humans into the mix, implementation details into the mix, potential changes into the mix, it turned out that they still weren't necessarily totally resilient. if that language makes any sense, right?
Yeah, it's like the existence of artificial intelligence implicitly predicts the existence of artificial stupidity, right? So there's always going to be some dumb person out there who's going to, pull the wrong cord or inject the wrong line of code that's going to bring the whole thing down to its knees. So,
Yeah.
So I think we've learned that first of all, there's probably not going to be a data protection solution built on blockchain anytime in the near future. So I don't think we have to worry about that. And two, from a protection standpoint, I think you do. I think Tricia makes a good point, right? You always have to be able to have the speed and efficiency to unwind some problem very quickly and get back to operational. The question that I think we're alluding to now, and hopefully we can follow this up with, is how do you think about protecting that today to make sure that you're theoretically resilient if you're one of the links in the blockchain?
Yeah, and the other interesting thing to consider, and I just kind of popped in my head. So if you have a contract that exists in a blockchain framework and it, goes through its life cycle and, multiple contract participants touch it, and at some point it closes, the contract closes or it's expired or whatever. And at that point now you have this immutable entity that contains its entire, chain of custody and whole flow that brought it to that point in time where it became in theory immutable and closed. And so now it's sort of archived, but if it still exists out in the blockchain network, now you've got something that is a cold archived object, which is not being protected as you would normally protect a cold archive object, i.e. offsite, somewhere where it's in a vault or, offline in some way. So, to me, that suggests that maybe even in an environment where blockchain and this distributed ledger model and this kind of consensus contract model is widespread, there will probably always be the need for something akin to an archive, right? As we traditionally think about it. Now, again, maybe I'm wrong about that. I'm by no means an expert, but that's kind of an interesting thought exercise in my mind.
Okay, Tricia, now you're up. What is Tricia's tool tip for the week?
I love this.
Tool time.
Tool time.
Today's tool time kind of follows up on last week. Last week we talked about adsm.org, which is a very technical interface, a lot of technical questions going on. If you look at our Spectrum Protect Professionals group on LinkedIn, you'll find another group of business partners, users, IBMers, and a lot of what I see going through.
I'm going to join. I just requested to join. Can you please approve my request?
I'll do it now.
Sorry,
and a lot of
Tricia.
the great things that go through here is a lot of announcements, a lot of new videos. So it kind of keeps you up to date on what's coming out, what's going on, what kind of, if we're going to be at a different technical conference. So it's another good way to stay abreast of what's happening in the Spectrum Protect world.
Yeah, and we put all of our SpectrumCast in that Protect Professionals group. So if you just want to have kind of a one-stop shop to get some good information as well as the SpectrumCast, it'd be great if you could join that. That's great.
Yeah, I think these things are, their benefit equates to how many people are active in them, using them in a lot of circumstances. And this is one where there are a good number of people who are active and a good amount of information in it. So it's a useful resource, a useful social resource to have.
I feel like I should. Changing my mind. I'm going to withdraw my request.
Yeah, but now that Randy's there, you may want to.
Yeah,
you may want to start looking elsewhere.
I don't know if I want to be a member of any group that would have someone like me as a member. Quite honestly. But.
Well, I just accepted you, Randy. So now you're in. You can't run and hide now.
Awesome. I'm in the in crowd now. Cool.
Great. All right, team. Hey, I want to thank us for. Oh, Randy, you were going to say?
Sorry. No. I'm good. Good stuff.
I was just going to say thank you all. The very interesting, enlightening conversation. I think it gives our listeners something to think about, and maybe later in this year we'll follow it up with some new information that we find out. Yeah,
I was just going to say I'm sure at least half of what I said is BS. So I mean, if you consume this video and check it out, and you want to correct me, or you want to fire some questions at us, or you want to add something to the conversation, I'd be very curious to learn more about this because I find it kind of fascinating.
And, there are a lot of great folks out there on LinkedIn, as Tricia just pointed out, that have some data protection expertise. So if you'd like to be a guest on SpectrumCast and kind of help us through this conversation, we're more than welcome to have you. So it'd be great.
Cool. Yes, absolutely.
All right. With that, I want to thank everyone and have a great day.
Thanks all.